Hello, and welcome to this session on spiritual resilience in challenging times. My name is Connie Foray, and I'm very glad you're here. Today, in a very short period of time, we're going to be taking a look at a model for developing spiritual resilience, a practical model for deepening spiritual resilience that that research indicates can be helpful for us and for our students and for our community. And I'd like to sort of place this into our theological or faith context here, into the ministry of Jesus as a healer. And I'd like to start with just a really quick story. A number of years ago, I was part of an interfaith group that was visiting different places of worship in the Twin Cities area. And we were visiting a Zen meditation center. And one of the people in our group asked the monk who was conducting the tour, "Why do people come here? What is it that draws people to your place?" And without hesitation, the monk said, "People come because they're suffering." And I was really struck by that, both because I knew it was true. If I think about what I have read about Western Buddhism or mindfulness, what I know is that people are drawn to it often because there's a crisis in their lives or because the chronic stress is getting to be too much. So number one, I knew that to be true, and it was kind of striking. And the other thing was that I wondered about our young people. And I wonder if they see our churches and our schools as places that they can go when they're suffering, and a place that will be able to offer them help. And I think our schools, I think that they generally do see that as a place of community and support. I wonder about our churches. What we know is that Jesus, this icon, is obviously Jesus is interacting and is drawing people who are suffering with all kinds of things. And part of what we're doing with this session is taking a look at what do we do with the suffering that we're all experiencing, and how can we use that and transform it and help it to bring us closer to one another and to God and to our best selves rather than farther away. And there's kind of good news and bad news about this. I want to just kind of, by way of preliminary introduction, kind of review those quickly. I'm going to talk about the bad news kind of quickly, but the bad news is bad news. And we know that there is all kinds of stuff swirling around us right now. And not only is there an overwhelming amount of stuff going on, but it keeps changing. And so it's very hard for us. It's hard for us to abstain. We are tempted to be sucked into just kind of checking that news cycle. And so for a lot of us, our emotional reserves are going thin. And that is, teachers are among the frontliners on that particular issue. A couple of indicators are that, for example, the U.S. Surgeon General has issued an advisory on the state of the mental health of young people, and that secular organizations like, this is the Journal of the American Medical Association, have also declared a global crisis in child and adolescent mental health. One of the things that, one of the threads through this conversation, I think, is that, or that's getting lost actually in this conversation, is that the decline in child, adolescent, and young adult mental health did not start with the pandemic, and it did not start with the political unrest. It predates that by a number of years. And there's some good news embedded in that. One of the things that's true, one of the things that's being researched and being discovered, part of the good news, is that spirituality has a very strong protective factor, especially for young people, against depression, anxiety, and risk-taking behavior. So on the one hand, we have the fact that our churches, attendance in our churches is going down. Growing numbers of young people do not identify with a particular faith tradition. And at the same time, our faith traditions, our Catholic tradition, hold very powerful resources to help our young people to cope and to help us to cope. A piece of that is the research that's coming out in the last particular 20 years about neuroscience, about our brains and our nervous systems, and about how our bodies and our spirits and our thought processes work together. And that there are things that we can do, spiritual practices that we can do that have been demonstrated by research to have a significant and positive impact. And the other piece of good news is that these practices aren't new. We may do them a little bit differently. We may be bringing them back up when they have, in some places, fallen into disuse. But these are practices that have been with us since before the time of Jesus, many of them. So that's the good news. So talking about this session, what we're going to be doing in this session. This is a tall order, but my hope is that what you'll do is you'll walk away, even if you don't remember the details of this session, that you'll walk away with three things. One is just this whole notion of spiritual resilience as a lens to consider some of the things that we're doing, some things that we might do, and an awareness that there's such a thing as spiritual resilience, and that it's not just something that you're born with, although genetics has a role in it. The second thing is we're going to talk about spiritual emotions and the fact that there is such a thing as spiritual emotions and that they have the capacity to heal us. And the third thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about a couple of practical spiritual habits that we can integrate into our own lives. We can bring our students to do it not just at school, but to do it at home. And we can share these practices with our parents as well. Now, I, like you, have been to a lot of workshop sessions, and I've been to a lot of good workshop sessions. And I like them when I'm there, and I take some notes, and I go home and I lose my notes, and I forget what I learned because life is busy. And in hopes of minimizing that a little bit, I'm going to ask you to think of this session as being a little bit closer to an online basketball clinic, even though that would clearly have limitations, but an online basketball clinic which is geared towards a practical response versus a college lecture. And in order to help us to do that, I'm going to ask you, if you don't already have something that you can write with, to take a minute, turn the session off, go get something, however you take notes these days, to get whatever it is that you would need in order to take these notes. And then what I'm going to invite you to do before we move on is to take a few minutes and think about 3 names of people that you would consider to be spiritually resilient. And we don't yet have a definition of spiritual resilience. We don't need a definition of spiritual resilience because we have this sort of intuitive sense of what spiritual resilience is. And so jot down 3 names. This could be someone you know. It could be someone who's famous, either past or present. Or it could be someone fictional even. But jot down those names. And then take a look at those names and think about what are the qualities that these people have that would cause you to consider them to be spiritually resilient. What is it that made those names come to mind for you? So we'll just take a couple minutes, jot those down. And now I'm going to show you a couple of faces, and these are often names, the first 2 are often names that come up when I'm able to do this in person. So, excuse me, Pope Francis, and I love this picture of him because my guess is that little boy is not supposed to be up there, that he ran up there, and that what we can see is Pope Francis isn't ignoring him. He's got his hand down there, but he's continuing to focus on his audience. And whatever his message is, and the smile is so there. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when we think about what he saw and what he lived through and what he was able to help with healing in South Africa, one of the astonishing things is that most often when you see a picture of him, there's this wonderful smile on his face. And then this Nepalese woman, I don't know her, but her face to me expresses some of the qualities of spiritual resilience. And so I'm putting her in there as a stand-in for grandparents everywhere. And if we think about the people that you chose and or these folks, I think generally what we see is these people there's sort of a sense of calm within them, which doesn't mean they don't get upset, but it's kind of the default reflex response. There's a calm, there's a strength in that calm. There's a joy. All of them are smiling. And there's a sense of integrity about them. And so let's take a look and let's cross-check that with the definition that I've got. And there are a lot of definitions of spiritual resilience out there. This is our working definition. It's one that I like. And so this resilience is an ability, it's a capacity to maintain a sturdy, positive spirit. And again, that doesn't mean that these are people who are cheerful all the time, who won't engage in suffering, pretend that things are fine when they're not. But there is still this capacity for compassion, joy, some things that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The second is a clear sense of purpose and meaning. And this, as I've been doing this work, this component kind of has presented itself over and over. One of the things that research shows us is that there is a stronger correlation between suicide and a loss of purpose and meaning than there is between suicide and depression, which is pretty astonishing. And we talk way more about depression than we do about purpose and meaning. And research also tells us that the majority of young people do not have a clear sense of purpose and meaning. So that's the second thing. And the third thing is even in the face of suffering. So this is the ability to maintain these, which requires us to engage with suffering and to be able to work through it and transform it and come out the other side. So those are the three elements. We are only going to tackle the first of these three in this session, and we're only going to graze the surface of that. But those are three, I would say, essential components of being able to thrive. And that is what spiritual resilience does, is it helps us to thrive. Okay, so this is an infographic, kind of naming all of those components and mentioning the fact that we are way more able to do this if we do it together. If you take a look at these folks, I would be willing to bet that when I pulled those faces up, that you just reflexively smiled. One of the things that's true is that we have what are called mirror neurons in our brains, and we are inclined to, when we see an emotion expressed in someone else's body language or their face, we automatically and almost immediately experience a little bit of that same emotion. So one of the wonderful things about people who are spiritually resilient is not only can we see them and sort of intellectually go, okay, I'd like to learn from them, but that resilience is contagious. Something happens to us simply being in the presence of these people. And the good news about that is that makes us very powerful as we develop our own capacity for spiritual resilience. Just one note on the infographic. If you decide to share that, I would just please request that you keep the copyright notice on it. Thank you. Okay, so we just talked about what spiritual resilience is. Second thing is we're going to talk about spiritual emotions. And there are other spiritual emotions than these, but this is 8 that we focus on in this particular model. And these emotions are gratitude, serenity, hope, joy, compassion, inspiration, awe, and love. And I'm going to invite you to take a look at those and just kind of reflect on them for a minute to see what is it that they have in common. If you'd like, if you want to reflect on it, you can turn this off and give yourself a minute, jot down some things. But you'll notice that happiness is not on here. Joy is. And I would submit that joy, like these other emotions, goes deeper than happiness. These emotions don't really depend. Certainly, we are all impacted by what's going on in our lives. These emotions don't really ultimately depend on our circumstances. You all know people who have suffered a great deal and have serenity or gratitude, amazingly, compassion for others. So I would say a couple things is, number one, these all feel good. And I think even going beyond feeling good, when we experience these emotions, we have this sense of being at home. That, at least for a moment, that things make sense. It's not that we could put it into words, but this feeling of coming home. These all take us beyond ourselves. They connect us to our best selves. They connect us to the person that God created us to be. They connect us to one another, and they connect us to God. And there's a whole lot more that we could say about these, and there's a ton of research out on these. I'm just going to pull one emotion out, and that is the emotion of awe. And I have to admit, we say something is awesome. I have to admit I hadn't really thought that much about it, and I kind of stuck it in this list, and then I started noticing where this was showing up. I just want to share with you a few things. So first of all, if you think about what happens when we look at a night sky, and you may or may not currently be able to see, I've never seen this many stars, but you may or may not be at a place where you've got an open look at the sky. I hope that at some point in your life, at least, you've had the opportunity to see the sky and a kind of a broad expanse of the sky. But when we do that, there's something that happens to us. And when I show a slide like this, it's like we all have the same reaction. There is, if you think about it, when you're under a night sky, do you feel big or small? Generally, we feel small, but in a good way. And if you are really in the depths of despair or intense loneliness, this can make you feel more lonely. But most of the time, there is something about this, and we don't argue ourselves into this. It just happens. It just happens, and it's kind of a whole person thing. But we have this sense that we are small, but that we are part of something big and part of something good. And one definition of awe that I've heard that makes sense to me is that awe is what we feel when we are in the presence of something greater than us that we don't understand. And there's something about seeing this that it humbles us. It reminds us that we're not the center of the universe. And one of the things that gets us into trouble is thinking we're the center of the universe or trying to become the center of the universe. This just reminds us. It puts things in perspective without any argument. And it's hard to mount an argument against it when we're there. When we're there. And that even with that humility, listen, this isn't always the case, but there can be a sense of security that comes somehow in this. And for those of us who are believers, it is a reminder of the majesty of God. And that God ultimately holds all things in God's hands. This experience, one of the things that Lisa Miller, who's a researcher at Columbia, would say, she would argue that spirituality is a capacity that we have, just like vision, just like the capacity to do math. It is there, and we can either develop it or we can ignore it. And that taking opportunities like this and noticing them when they cross our paths, which is more often than we think, develops our capacity for spirituality. So one of the things that's true is that a lot of us who are working in faith-based settings are a little behind the curve in terms of our awareness of what's being done, the kind of research that's being done. There's actually a ton of research being done on awe. I had absolutely no idea until about 6 months ago. And just as a couple of examples, this is, for example, a listing of scholarly articles on awe. Awe in Nature Heals, evidence from military veterans, at-risk youth, and college students. Mechanistic and functional analysis of awe in the outdoors. Big smile, small self. Awe walks, which are walks, well, not necessarily walks in nature. There's more to be said about that. Promote pro-social positive emotions in older adults. The overview effect, transcendence and sublime experience in nature. Connection to brands that help others versus help the self. Awe in the natural environment. There is an amazing amount of research out there. And one of the things that I discovered was that Columbia University, in conjunction with the New York Police Department, put on a remarkable symposium. And I was able to, you can go on YouTube and get some of these talks. But they were talking about the importance of awe for police officers. And there was one little mini session on awe and hostage negotiation. And the part of the sort of the gist of this is that noticing awe, paying attention to awe, helps law enforcement people to stay in touch with their mission and not get caught up in some of the other things that are going on. I had no idea that this work was being done, and I was super impressed with the presenters on this. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Maybe during the summer, you'd have time to take a look at it. So what we're talking about is our need for spiritual resilience, the power of spiritual emotions. There is a ton of research out there that says that correlates these emotions with reduced cortisol in our systems, reduced blood pressure. There's physical implications of experiencing these emotions, and then behavioral implications. And for those of us who are struggling with student behavior, including risky behavior that happens off campus, one of the good things to know is that there is research that shows that if we can increase students' experience of these emotions, there are positive behavioral outcomes. The third thing on our ambitious list for today is to touch on the notion of spiritual practices, or another way to call them, I think, is soul habits. There are lots of spiritual practices, lots of spiritual practices in our tradition, elsewhere. But I'm choosing these 6 as elements of what we're going at, and we will only talk about 2. So gratitude, there are now gratitude t-shirts, gratitude journals, gratitude beer. Honest to goodness, there's gratitude beer. Gratitude has become trendy. Asking blessing, music, one-liners, which can either be one-liners as in a word or phrase that we would use during prayer, or they can be one-liners that we use during the day as sort of a reset button. There's a practice of letting go, and then there's service. Because one of the things that's true about emotions is part of their purpose is to prepare us for action. And if we're going to go full circle on this, we need to have an outlet in action, and service is how that happens. Okay, so I'm going to talk just about a couple of spiritual practices, one of which is asking blessing. And I think, number one, I just like this picture because it took me by surprise, which is, it just did. My husband rides a motorcycle, but I don't know a lot of people who ride motorcycles, and I have never seen a group of bikers asking a blessing on their bikes. And I find it touching. So asking blessing is something that we can do in kind of 2 different ways. We can ask blessing, well, maybe 3. We can ask blessing on people that we love, which comes more easily. A lot of us grew up as little kids doing that. God bless mom and dad, blah, blah, blah. but maybe we forget about it. We can ask blessing on strangers. I was brought up as a Catholic kid in the 50s that when I heard a siren, when I saw an ambulance, I prayed for those people. I still do that. And I have added on to that whenever I see a police car, whenever I see someone pulled over. I just automatically say a prayer. And I think one of the things that does, part of what we're doing is we're building different mental habits. And so if I'm driving along thinking about whatever I'm thinking and I see an ambulance and I remember to ask God to bless those people, that takes me out of my everyday stuff and reminds me that I'm part of this larger community. And then I go back to whatever I was doing. But asking blessing and teaching our students to ask blessing. We do that in school. We do that in morning prayer. We do it at the beginning of class. But to also just kind of weave it throughout our days. And it doesn't take any time hardly at all. That part is not particularly hard. The hard part is remembering. Asking blessing on people who are difficult, that's a lot harder. And Jesus was real clear. Jesus told us to pray for our enemies, and he wasn't kidding. And he did it. And if you think about what's going on in the world today, if all of us every day took some time out and asked God to bless whoever's on the opposite side of the fence from us, whoever it is, and ask God to bless them, I think things would be different. And I think it's perfectly legitimate prayer to ask God to change somebody's mind, change their heart, help them to see things differently. That's a really legitimate prayer, but it's not this prayer. This prayer, we just ask God to bless them. And then we stop talking. God doesn't need our instructions. God gets it. Part of what I'm doing is I'm remembering God's intention for that person or that group of people, and I'm remembering God's intention for me. And so this one, I think it's relatively recent that I do this on a very regular basis. I find myself going down a rabbit hole, and I call myself back and just say, God bless them. For many years there was, and this goes back a long time, there was a landmark that I passed on the highway very frequently. And there was someone that whenever I passed by that landmark, I would pray for that person. And I would say it didn't make things go away. And some days it didn't even feel like it made any difference. But I am confident that that recurring decision to ask God's blessing made a difference. And that was healing for me, as well as providing healing for that relationship. So that's an important one. The next one that I'd like to talk about is much more fun, and that is music. This woman, this is a shot from a movie called Alive Inside, which I highly recommend. But this woman has just been fitted with headphones, and the music that she's listening to is music that she loved when she was young. And we have discovered, we've kind of known this all along, that music hits us. I mean, there's very few young people who don't listen to music. We know that it expresses our moods. We know that it changes our moods. We now have brain imaging that shows that it bypasses the verbal part of our brains, activates all over our brain, and it's really powerful. And it's being used as a form of therapy. There is music therapy, it's particularly with people who are experiencing dementia. And I can remember that my uncle, a couple of months before he died, and he had been nonverbal for a while, but it was Christmas season and they were doing Christmas sing-along. And he not only was singing the words, he was harmonizing to the music. And so there's, we have our church music, but there's all kinds of, what I would encourage us to do is sort of, if you don't already, to expand our the range of music that we use, and to invite students to take the lead on this. And there are a lot of sort of specific practices that you can do. There's a campus minister who, what she does is she has a group form a playlist, and everybody puts one piece of music on there. And then they play it for the group, and people try to guess who selected that piece of music, which is a great way of starting a conversation. Another thing that we can do for ourselves or for students is to develop a playlist, to take a look at that list of spiritual emotions, think about which ones come easily, which ones are a stretch, and then to assemble a list of music that evokes an emotion that we would like to experience more often. And then just to take some time on some kind of a regular basis to listen to that music. And again, it's just like we're not arguing ourselves into anything. We are somehow touching our whole selves when we do that. This is a picture of a Taizé prayer service. It's not in Taizé, but it's a Taizé prayer service. And to me, the Taizé community is such a great example of the power of music. Ever since World War II, they have been drawing young people. And there is something about the quality of that Taizé music that, number one, crosses denominational lines, that draws young people, even though it's not at all contemporary young people's music. And it just does something to us. There's just something calming, that kind of spiritual resilience that we're talking about. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with music. So those are, that's just a tiny little dipping our little toe into this notion of spiritual practices. And again, the ones that we are using are, or naming at least, are gratitude, asking blessing when it's easy, when it's hard, music, expanding our notion of what is sacred inducing music, one-liners, letting go. Letting go is so important. And then service, because this work is incomplete unless it is expressed in our behavior. And so I would, quick review. What we did is to talk about the need for spiritual resilience and what it is. We talked about what spiritual emotions are and their capacity to heal us, and the research that says, yes, really, this is true. And then a few practical, quick spiritual habits that can help our students, can help us, and can help our community. And so I want to thank you for your presence, your virtual presence here. Thank you for all the work that you do, for your work with our young people, which is so important. You will never know the ripples that happen as a result of the work that you have with your students and with your colleagues and with your parents. And so if there's anything that I can do to be of help, please don't hesitate. Or if you have questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I ask God's blessing on you and your loved ones, your community, and on us all. Thank you.